about molar mass, and we said that molar mass is grams per mole. And it could be grams of an element or it could be grams of a molecule. How many grams of that you have per mole. Now, in order to figure out the molar mass of any element like boron or oxygen or magnesium, all you have to do is just look at the number at the bottom. Okay, we usually call this the atomic mass, and that'll give you the molar mass for that element. In other words, for magnesium, the molar mass is 24 grams of magnesium for every 1 mole of magnesium, right? And that's molar mass, or grams per mole. So once again, if I do boron, boron is, I'm going to round that 10.8 to 11, so it's 11 grams of boron per mole of boron. So try to do oxygen right now and see if you can get it. So pause it and see if you can get oxygen. Okay, oxygen's molar mass, it's 15.9, so I'm going to round that to 16 grams per mole. Grams of oxygen per mole of oxygen. Okay. Okay, so what if I say you have 1 mole of oxygen, or sorry, let's say I say you have 16 grams of oxygen, right? How many moles of oxygen do you have? Well, the molar mass says I have 16 grams of oxygen for every 1 mole of oxygen. So 16 grams of oxygen means I have 1 mole of oxygen. They're the same thing. If I were to count 1 mole of oxygen atoms, all of them, if I weigh them, would weigh 16 grams. What happens if I have 8 grams of oxygen? How many moles of oxygen would I have? Well, if 16 grams of oxygen equals 1 mole, and now I have 8 grams of oxygen, well, 8 is half of 16, so I would have half a mole of oxygen. Okay, now that's a pretty simple example. So that was an easy problem. Now what happens if I say, all right, you have 0.75 grams of oxygen. How many moles of oxygen is that? That's a little trickier problem. So what we're going to do today is you're going to figure out how to do these types of problems, how to go from grams of something to moles of something. Okay, so that's what we're going to be doing today. So these are your notes. I would recommend writing the stuff we did a little while ago. You can write that in this space right here, okay, just so you have a little bit of a reference. But we're going to start on our first problem right here. Okay, so we're going to be introducing this concept known as dimensional analysis. And don't worry about the long name, it's really not that complicated. Okay, so here's basically how it works. All right, so let's look at our question here. It says, how many moles of carbon are in 3.5 grams of carbon? So the way we have our dimensional analysis set up is we have a given, a wanted at the end, and then in this we're going to have our molar mass. We're going to put that in the middle right here, and I'll explain why in a little while. So let's start with our given. Our given in this case is what amount they gave us in the problem. In this case, 3.5 grams of carbon. So imagine someone gave you some carbon. Here's my carbon. And it weighed 3.5 grams. 3.5 grams of carbon. Imagine someone literally just gave that to you. So that's my given. And I'm going to write that here. 3.5 grams carbon. Okay. I'm going to put that over 1. All right. Just remember to put a 1 there. You're going to do that for all these other problems too. And now let's look at our wanted. What do they want you to figure out? Well, they want how many. I want to know how many. That's what I want to know. How many moles of carbon? So my wanted is going to be moles of carbon. So now that you have your given units, and your wanted units, which are moles of carbon. Now we're going to fill in this middle part to figure out how we can go from grams of carbon, to moles of carbon. Okay, and this is kind of an algebra technique, this thing that we use dimensional analysis here, but it's a pretty simple idea. Okay, so we're starting off, we're given grams of carbon. We want moles of carbon, which means that we have to cancel out grams of carbon. We don't want that unit anymore. In order to cancel it out, what you got to do is just put it next door and on the bottom. Okay, I should say diagonal from the previous unit. So notice that this unit is diagonal, right? It's kind of diagonal from this unit right there. Okay, so my units go down here so they can cancel out. Well, what about on the top? What am I going to put on the top here? Well, here I can actually put moles of carbon. Okay, so that's a unit I'm going to put on top. Now, once again, because these units, grams of carbon and grams of carbon, are diagonal from each other, they cancel out. And what unit am I left with? I'm left with moles of carbon, which is the unit that I'm looking for. Okay, so at this point, I'm good. I've canceled out the units and I got the unit that I want to keep. So what's my next step? I gotta fill in the numbers. I gotta fill in some numbers in these empty spaces right here. Okay, so where am I going to get those numbers from? Well, if you look at my units, you'll see that I have moles on the top, moles of carbon, and grams of carbon. Now this probably looks hopefully kind of familiar to you guys. What are the units for molar mass? They are molar mass is grams per mole. Look at your units over here. We have moles per gram, or if I read it upside down, it's grams per mole. It turns out that molar mass, you can write it either way. You can write it grams per mole, or you can put it moles per gram. It's still molar mass. Okay? Now the only thing different here is obviously the grams are on the bottom and the moles are on the top. But the process is the same. Okay? How do you get molar mass? Well, once again, if you're looking for the molar mass of carbon, if I want to get the molar mass of carbon, I look at the periodic table, right? Here's my periodic symbol for carbon. And you get your molar mass, like we mentioned earlier, you get it from this bottom number right here. So what is the molar mass of carbon? The molar mass of carbon is 12 grams of carbon per 1 mole of carbon. Okay, that's how you write molar mass for carbon. Now, once again, up here on the, kind of in this problem right here, the moles is on the top and the grams is on the bottom, and that's fine, okay, as long as the numbers match up, okay? Now, how many grams of carbon do I have? I have 12 grams of carbon. So up here in the problem, I'm going to write my number 12 on the bottom because it's 12 grams of carbon. And how many moles of carbon? It's per 1 mole of carbon. So up here I put 1 mole. Okay, so you can see here it's still the molar mass of carbon. I still have 12 grams of carbon per 1 mole of carbon. Okay, that's still the molar mass of carbon. It's just I flipped the numbers in the units, but that's fine. Okay, so now we can actually solve our problem. Here's how you solve these problems. Okay, all you got to do is you just multiply across the top. Okay, so I put a little multiplication sign there. Let me write it in a little darker. I'll multiply across the top and see what that equals. 3.5 times 1 is 3.5. Okay, so I did the top. Now I'm going to multiply across the bottom. 1 times 12 equals 12. Okay, and I want you to notice how on the top, you have units on the top, you have moles of carbon, and in the bottom there's no units at all because the 1 doesn't have a unit and the 12, the grams of carbon, got canceled out. So notice this 12 on the bottom doesn't have any units, and that's fine, that's what we want. All we got is moles of carbon on the top. Okay. All right, so we did our multiplication across the top. We did our multiplication across the bottom. Now what we're going to do is we're going to divide these two numbers. What is 3.5 divided by 12? So I plug that in and it's 0.29160. Okay, so what I'm going to do is for my answer, I am just going to write the 0.29. Okay, I'm going to write it in this blue color. So 0.29. And what are my units? Well, the units that are left over are moles of carbon. Okay, so now I know if I have 3.5 grams of carbon, 3.5 grams of carbon, now I know that is going to equal 0.29 moles of carbon. Okay, so I figured out how many moles of carbon are in 3.5 grams of carbon. All right. So you can pause right here. You can copy everything down if you need to a little more. I'm going to erase this. Okay. And somewhere else on the sheet, what I want you to do is I want you to do another practice, and we can still use carbon. Okay. But I'm going to change this. I'm going to change the 3.5 grams. I'm going to change that to, let's say, 46 grams of carbon. And I want you guys to try figuring this out on your own. Okay. So on either on a separate sheet of paper or on these notes somewhere, try to answer this problem. So go ahead and figure it out. What I am going to do right now is I am going to write the answer that you're supposed to get. So work out the problem, and your final answer should be 3.8 moles of carbon. So go ahead and work this problem out and see if you get that answer, okay? Think about it, work through it, and if you get this answer, then you're fine. That's as hard as these kind of problems are going to get, the element problems. What we're going to do right now in the next video is we're going to look at molecules, okay? In this case, we're trying to figure out what is the moles of, how many moles are in 36 grams of water, okay? And we know that water is H2O. Okay, so how do you get the molar, how do you work out these problems for molecules? Okay, so we'll talk about that in the next video.